to another episode of Twice Told Tales podcast. Today we have a extremely interesting guest that I've been wanting to talk to for a long time. Fergie Chambers. He he's kind of a hard person to put a label on. He has probably his life experience is more than almost anyone I can think of in terms of everything from economic theory to political theory to religious theory. I think he has more of a hands-on understanding of the world than most people. So I'm very happy to actually have him on, because I believe not only is he a fascinating guest, but I think we have scooped Joe Rogan, because I think if there's any guest in the world that should be on the Joe Rogan podcast, it is definitely Fergie Chambers, because not only is he a very fascinating international man of mystery with very interesting politics, but he's also into MMA. So
I was gonna say, aside from all the sort of political stuff, is like my life is really like otherwise based around MMA. So yeah.
It's like you're the natural Joe Rogan guest. I don't know how that has never happened. So hopefully someone can see this this little podcast we do and get your voice out there, because you are a very interesting dude. So why don't you could you just maybe introduce yourself to audience of I guess we have mostly Iranians and some Americans who watch this show, and just introduce yourself and let them know who you are.
We have people from different parts of the world. We don't have a very large audience, but we have people from Latin America, Arab countries, and Russia also watching this. So it would be very interesting to,
okay. So my name's Fergie Chambers. Some people call me by other names, but that's what I've gone by mostly since I was born. And I am originally from the U.S., from New York, but also a lot of time in New England and Atlanta. And I have spent most of my life between some degree of kind of activism or political work and sports, actually, sort of concurrently. And there's been a wide range in terms of what that political work has meant, from kind of like community organizing to direct action to journalism, and then a lot of actually funding. Like I have a foundation that is mostly really committed to, it's US based, and it's committed to anti-imperialist causes, primarily. I came from a very prominent and wealthy US family, and I ended up having a very different perception of the world than they do, and then I think most of that sort of circuit does, for a lot of reasons. And I now live in Tunisia, where I'm again on the business end of things. I'm involved in sports, almost exclusively in sports, but I still operate the U.S. Foundation and sort of and politically involved on that level. I'm really not politically involved in Tunisia. I'm a foreigner living here, and it's not their internal affairs are not my issues. And I'm for just over a year now. I'm a Muslim since I moved here, and that there was an intentionality to that as well. Although I've been worshiping the God of Abraham in some capacity for most of my life, but lacking the clarity and the fullness of Islam until just over a year ago. So I think that's...
Welcome to the club.
Thank you. Yeah, as I said, Alhamdulillah sounds very long and like Fusha to me. It's like the Tunisian dialect, which I've learned a good bit of, is like very contracted Arabic. So when people come and from the Levant or from somewhere else, or if they're not Arabic but they speak from like Quran or something, it sounds like someone kind of talking Shakespeare, like going into like a pub in the Bronx and speaking Shakespearean English. because it's like hal min al mumkin, and and it's like everything here. It's just like squeezed together with little bits of French and like amazigh thrown into it, and it's like it's another language almost. So yeah. So that's kind of what I do. I've done a lot of writing in my life, but essentially, look, I was because I was born into a unique position. Partially because of what I mentioned about my family, but partially because I think I was really blessed to be around some great political minds from a young age. I've been more like instead of defining a specific career as like, oh well, this is what I do in the movement, or this is what I kind of have tried to make myself as useful as I can be, which I guess I consider it my responsibility and my obligation to do, being the beneficiary of many generations of American capitalism and colonialism, which whatever, the material reality is that the comforts I have in life and the resources I had, they are what they are, they exist. But there's a responsibility, as I said, to do something about that, and it goes beyond kind of like simple charity. So that's why I think it's hard to define like what do I do. Like if someone needs to go and report on something and I can do it, then I'll do it. If someone needs to donate to something, I'll do it. Especially when I was a little younger, if someone needed to get a little crazy, I was willing to do it. Not to say I wouldn't now, but it just depends on context. Yeah.
Well, I would love to like break up the various kind of like transitions that you've had in your life, because I think everyone sort of struggles with these, especially intelligent, curious people who come up to positions where the world sort of like forces them to shut up and go along with the agenda rather than being curious and finding your own route. And very few people do that. And I think when you do that, you find yourself very isolated because the world starts hating you because you're not going along with the prescribed agenda. And I would just be curious.
There's a Flannery O'Connor quote that's tattooed on my arm. Of course, I got a million tattoos put on my body when I was younger. But it's you shall know the truth, and the truth will make you odd. Which of course is rephrasing.
Wow.
That's a great tattoo. That's a perfect quote.
Wow. It's a good one. It's a good one. And of course, look, in my situation, of course, I think I never want people to have the perception that I'm kind of like, oh well, I went against the grain and I did what I wanted and I explored and you could too. Why didn't you? Like, I understand that my material position has allowed me the flexibility to make the choices that I've made, no doubt. Most people don't have the option. So I think sometimes people that come from a position like mine can be a little bit blinded by it. Why don't you just do what I do? So I just think it should be, and I'm not saying that everyone in my position does exactly what I've done either. Most of them don't, but it's certainly afforded by that.
Well, Bill Gates says that the reason that he doesn't have to be environmentally conscious is because he buys carbon credits. So we won't get into the whole situation. At least you're doing something more than that.
I can. It's like, I can just chain smoke cigarettes as long as I have a carrot stick every time I have a cigarette. Right. It's that mentality, right?
Right. Well, I was gonna say, like, your tattoos were a big reason why you're on this podcast, because like I was. About a little over 2 years ago, I was sitting in my friend's house and we were like binge watching Texas Bentley's YouTube channel because we just couldn't get enough of that guy. Like, his politics were amazing, and he was so brave and so like determined to stick up for the people of Donbass and Eastern Ukraine in their now Russia. And there was this tattooed dude bouncing around in Bentley's truck, and we were like, and my friend here in Atlanta was like, "Hey, I know that guy. He's from Atlanta." And I was like, "What?" And so we looked into it, and so first, and then I read about you, and there's like a Rolling Stones article, and I was just like, "This is the most intriguing guy," and so that's how you ended up on the
piece. Kind of a hit piece.
It's kind of hippie, but if you read, hit pieces are always complimentary if you know reality. It's fascinating. I was just looking at like a conspiracy site the other day, and like the profiles they give people. It's just like, if you understand the world, these are like CVs. But anyway, if anyone wants to see that, there was an interview that the Grayzo did with you in Texas. So maybe we could talk about your experience there in Ukraine, because I think that was very fascinating to hear you talk about that. And also, if you could talk about how you, as a youngster, deviated from what your family probably intended for you to end up as, and like how your family today. I know your grandmother was liberal. She had her politics weren't as terrible as a lot of oligarchs' politics would be. So maybe you could talk about like that, a little bit of that family history, and how you managed to evolve so much more than the typical offspring of American oligarchy.
Yeah, and it's exactly that. It's American oligarchy. There's a lot of reasons, again, like most things that happen because of a lot of environmental circumstances, and never usually just because like the individual is so gifted or something. I mean, for one thing, look, my father, who I don't have a relationship with, but he was for much of his life kind of, I think, trying to break out of that mold. And he was kind of rebellious. He was kind of black sheepy. I don't think he really ever crossed the boundary of like ideological class struggle, slash like anti-imperialism. I think he got to that point of like 90s really liberal, where he like looked really funky, and was like, but he still like liked Bill Clinton, but there was a precedent there, and my grandmother to some extent being, having been born in a governor's mansion, and somebody that basically, I don't know that she ever cooked a meal, to advance to the point that she did, where even like culturally sort of allowing some of the friends that I had around her, she started it, I think. And then my mother's family was not from any kind of oligarchy at all. I mean, they were liberals of a different ilk. But they were, like my grandparents were born working class in the Midwest, but then like kind of, were sort of micro versions of an almost real American dream, like did well in school and, made it to Cambridge, Mass, to, the big institutions there. My grandmother on my mother's side was a early computer programmer, like in fact may have coined the term software engineering, and programmed the flight operating systems for the Apollo spaceships. But was like a lady from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan who ended up at MIT. She's still with us in Cambridge. She lives half a block away from the office of an Israeli weapons factory that I chained myself to the door of a year ago. And my grandfather ended up at Harvard Law. So, but again, like super liberal, just not from a ton of money and power. And so, my grandpa was like a civil libertarian attorney. So while he may not have agreed with him on everything, he like represented Kwame Ture, at the time Stokely Carmichael, in court in Cambridge in the 60s. So like there were ideas around, and there was a little bit of like counterculture in my upbringing. And then, I kind of got messed with by liberal society. I went to a fancy liberal school. I had trouble, like I had some trouble as a kid. Whatever, my parents got divorced, some things happened, the reaction in the 90s, especially from like elite parents, was to sort of like pathologize and medicate and institutionalize.
That's
And in my case, that led to a lot of abuse in institutions. It led to, you know, being sent away to like lockdown places for altogether, like collectively, like some years of my childhood. So that was a piece, I think, that made me think like something's a little dysfunctional about this way of thinking about things. I think there was a disconnect from, honestly, it's almost like a disconnect from the sacred that I felt growing up in the environment I did in kind of liberal 90s New York. Maybe I wouldn't have articulated that as easily at that point. And I also saw my father's family, who I was never really close with, other than my grandmother, and at times my father, but the rest of them, I mean, to me, they behaved like sociopaths. I mean, they you know, they kind of stabbed each other in the back, and they all had the wealth of a small nation and behaved like sort of warring states. And then they would like buy each other a $20,000 coat at Christmas in a room that you couldn't walk through because of the gilded wrapping paper covered presents, and with like kind of dogs peeing on everything while like black people served them. And I was like, wait, what's going on here? You know, like, because I was being raised by my mother mostly in Brooklyn. And again, like I didn't want for anything. And my dad was paying for a nice private school, but he wasn't around. So it was like I was leading kind of a middle class life, and was exposed to all sorts of normal people. So then I would like go around them and be like, these people are really messed up. There's something not okay about this. And then there were a few kind of big ideological influences. There was a history teacher I had who was kind of a Marxist, and then one of my dearest friends from childhood, who actually lives in Tunis now, is a sort of socialist academic, who influenced me from a very young age, and especially around Palestine. He was an anti-Zionist Jew. So I was like aware of that as a teenager. Again, as early as the 90s, kind of what that was about. And so all of those things sort of in concert with one another, and I'm sure a million other reasons that I haven't thought of, kind of led me to that. And then I think being able to step out of the kind of prism of like, look, most people that are drawn to socialism in the West, they kind of end up in these tunnels of like Trotskyist academia, or kind of like some form of radical liberalism, like Chomsky at best. And I think maybe that would have happened to me had I not gone to Russia as early as I did in life. My first wife was Russian, and I was the first time I went was in 2003, and in around like 2009, 10, 11, I lived there for some time with her. And some of that was, I think, about understanding the realities of the Soviet Union. Because I think I did have a little bit of this kind of Western Trotskyist mentality, like, oh, socialism's great, but it was kind of done wrong, maybe. So experiencing all these people who had actually lived through it, who were saying something else, even like her grandmother and what she had to say about Stalin had an effect on me. Like, oh, really? But then also just being out of the West, when I was like 17, 18 years old for a little bit, and being around, because I'd spent a lot of time in Europe growing up, but whatever, it's just like, the U.S. with better older decor, not a mall, but an artisanal market, it's like
that's a very good explanation how Europe looks. Yeah.
There's a mentality that exists when you step out of like the Western European ideological sphere, that I think, I mean, to me, it was just attractive. It was like, it felt like you were around people who cared about each other, without even making a show of it. It's just things. What I noticed was how things operated in an inherently kind of more collectivist way. Even like linguistically, right? Like in Russian, you can't say "I have this thing." You say like "in my vicinity exists this thing." It's like an example, of like similarly, like Arabic doesn't
Yeah,
quite
I was
have the
going to
verb
say the
to
same.
have, and
Yeah,
yeah,
it's very similar to Arabic in that. I mean, I don't
yeah.
know much Arabic, but the little one that I know, yeah, that's interesting.
So those are some of the things that really contributed to it, and also we were already hearing a lot of stuff about Putin by when I really lived there. Was like I said, like 2010, around then. This was post 2007, when he kind of drops the mic in Munich, after kind of being cool with W for a little bit, but then is like, nah, and sort of like really drags the US. We already start hearing how evil Putin is by then. Certainly from my dad. Like my dad, like probably the main reason my father and I don't speak is because of Putin. But I was like living there and was like, this is not the reality. It's just not the reality. I think there's actually just a different approach to politics. There's a different approach to authority. There's a different approach to national identity. So I can credit a lot of those things.
But when you say Putin, what you're really talking about is the influence of like imperialist, capitalist propaganda, because like these messages, the things we hear in the West that make us go insane on topics like that, when you go out and you physically encounter the things that you're told what they are in growing up in the West, and then you go out and see them and you realize they're completely opposite, like Palestinians, Palestine, with how they are. Like I've lived there, and you just see it's the complete opposite. These are the friendliest people in the world, and these are people who are just having stuff stolen from them by U.S. tax-funded psychopaths. These are not the terrorists. The terrorists are the Israelis. These are indigenous people who have thousands of years traced their ancestry back to Jesus, who was a Palestinian. I mean, the whole narrative that you get in the West is scrambled. So, like, I think when we say Putin or whatever, when we talk about those things, we're actually talking about this weird bubble that exists in the West that we kind of treat as if it's like the bubble that doesn't exist, but it's like a fantasy world. And I think like your upbringing, how you describe Christmas morning, I mean that's like a capitalist fantasy world that people have been like turned into even unwitting sociopaths because they had that environment to exist in, right?
No, like, totally. Well, and I think because even the elites who have access to like travel, and like their whole their lifestyle will be travel, like their identity will be travel, but they're like going to Western Europe, or they're like going to parts of the global South that are basically like colonized, like neo-colonies of the somewhere like Thailand, or like
but just staying in their hotels, right?
Right. Costa Rica. Yeah. And or they go on a guided trip, not now, but like 15 years ago, to St. Petersburg, Russia, where they're with a tour guide the whole time, and they see the Hermitage and Peterhof. Like there's not a sincere interaction with like the masses of the non-Western world. It doesn't happen. And in fact, sometimes the privilege to be able to go and explore these things gets people even more detached from the reality of things.
Well, and then
it exists on the other.
Go ahead.
I mean, it's the same thing exists on the other side of the world too. For example, when I talk about the problems that people have in Europe or in the US, there are like Iranians who say that they have traveled on tours to Europe and they didn't see like homeless people, or they didn't see any social problems there, which is, again, it reinforces the same propaganda that they have always heard about those countries without actually socializing or actually like experiencing the realities on the ground. It's just another way, a luxurious way to reinforce the propaganda that they have always been exposed to. But for Iranians, it's like how do you say, like glorifying what exists outside of their living place. But for like Europeans and Americans, it's mostly about, again, it's like still looking at people as others and being like those nations as being otherized without actually experiencing what those people think about their country or their identity and everything else.
Yeah. No, completely.
I was wanting to add, like, it's the tyranny of this bubble that I was describing is exemplified in this, because if you are like any of us who've been in other cultures and lived and learned and spoken the language of other places and understood them, and then you return to the bubble, it ostracizes you completely and your experiences.
Yeah.
Like, for example, if you go to a trip to Cancun and then you come back, all your friends, oh, Cancun, oh, great.
Right.
But my dad and I did, and we went to Mexico City and just rented a car and drove around for like 2 weeks and just stayed in little villages and went to see the monarch butterflies and like hiked a volcano and just did stuff on our own. We didn't have a guide. We just drove around, and it's the most beautiful, amazing country, and the people are so friendly. And if you say that to anyone here, they're like, oh, it's too dangerous. You're going to get shot by oh, you're crazy. Like, I mean, it's just the reaction is I don't know. It's tyrannical, is what it is in terms of
Well, it's extremely chauvinist. But some of that, I think, like, I mean, I had lived out of the U.S. before, and then when I came back from Donbass, in 2022, I stayed in the U.S. for another, I don't know, year and a half or so, or almost 2 years. But by that point, kind of the writing was on the wall. Like, I'm not going to be able to stay here. The reception to that, the reaction to what was happening in Ukraine, period, and the increasing levels of kind of political repression that were also just being sort of accepted by society at large, pretty tacitly, like it was nothing. But it was like that. It was like stepping way out of the bubble and then going back to the bubble and being like, whoa, this is not really going to work long term. And it's a lot of sort of why I'm where I am now. Was realizing that the time to get out of the bubble had come. And that was accelerated and perpetuated by the 7th of October. That kind of final realization, and recognizing that there was no way I was going to be able to exist maintaining the views that I did, supporting the organizations that I did, being involved in some of the actions I had in the past, or being accused of being involved with certain kinds of actions, and basically remain out of a cage if I were to stay in the U.S. long term. I mean, people talk about like I mean, even since I've left, there have been congressional subcommittees brought up to investigate like Students for Justice in Palestine chapters, and you get back to the fact that, like, I mean, I've been giving money to Students for Justice in Palestine since like 2005, so just simple things like this, like there's just no way they weren't going to call me the T word at some point. They were just going to do that.
Yeah,
probably. And I had friends who had gotten in trouble, and it was very clear there were like feds looking at me. I don't mind saying that. on here because I mean, the first time that was suggested was in like 2015, around like anti-police work in Atlanta, so I think it's just kind of obvious,
Gotta
yeah.
put that one out there. I really appreciate that work you did. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and then they started doing all these like trying to come at activists with these like conspiracy charges and things like this. So you throw in with that like a lot of resources, you throw in with that like probably some powerful people who aren't that happy with me. And it was just like, well, I guess I could like stick around and just see what happens and fight that fight. Or I could like, I think in the end, my closest comrades, and I'm talking about people that have, been around these movements for a very long time, who don't come from a lot of money, were basically like, bro, actually, like your ability to continue to benefit these projects that you're, even if I did nothing else except funding, nothing at all, because I'm not going to be big-headed enough to think that like my ideas or my great actions are actually more important than being able to send like hundreds of thousands of dollars to like right now, even just for medical aid in Gaza, right? Like it's not more important than that. So it was like, look, that project is more important than everything else, and you don't need to be in danger, and you're not 25 anymore, so you don't need to like be the one who's like taking rubber bullets at Standing Rock. You can like be a 40-year-old dad and run a foundation and maybe be in a little bit less danger.
And you're not understating that. The politics in America now is absolutely insane, and it's definitely slated to get worse in the near future. I mean, like
sure.
Prisoner support networks for Palestinian prisoners are being labeled and declared as terrorist organizations. So
yeah, my good friend, my good friend Charlotte is who I think you're referring to, their organization. I've seen her very recently. She her house was raided in Vancouver.
Insane.
Yeah, and it's like just who knows where it's going. And it was like, what, for the sake of my children, for the sake of, again, like the foundation continuing to exist, was it better to just like stick around and wait for them to tell me that that I was the H word, and that we're giving you 60 years, bye bye, no one will ever see you again? Like, it's just not worth it. I think there are fights that are worth fighting like that, and there's time that's worth doing, and there's risks that are worth taking, and then there are those that aren't. And we felt like we could be more useful to the world at large, not being in the U.S. anymore. So it's time to go.
And you're not alone. There's a lot of people
choosing
that.
Yeah. And it's not to get like, there's struggle that's real in the U.S. too. But I wish I didn't feel, I mean, I never want to feel nihilistic about any struggle, because it's not the right attitude. I don't know what is to be done in the U.S. right now. I know that there's not a really recognizable kind of political vanguard formation there. I know there are some sort of precursors to that look really good. I mean, some people that I have a lot of faith in, but I don't know what happens, and I don't know how I contribute to it. But like that realization happened, and I mean, I didn't even want to be like paying the full U.S. taxes anymore with what was happening in Gaza, and by then I was very clear, also that I wanted to convert to Islam, and so I wanted to go to a Muslim country that was sort of accessible, not Salafist, where they spoke a language I could speak, which I speak French since I'm little. And my now wife's sister lives in Sicily, which is like 50 miles away by water. So it was kind of, and again, I had some friends here, so I ended up here as an experiment, and then I really liked it. So the intention is to stay here, and maybe sort of sniff around out east part time too. In like places that are sanctioned by the U.S. and or maybe Uzbekistan, and I don't know yet. But kind of based here
or Iran.
Yeah, Iran.
Well, I said places that are sanctioned by the U.S.
Yeah, that's why.
Well, and in Russia again, I mean, I don't know,
Mhm.
but the base here is great. It's still accessible when people from the States want to visit. Like, I'll turn 40, inshallah, in 2 weeks, and we'll have a bunch of
Oh,
folks over to come hang out. They can get here pretty quickly and easily. And I have this like crazy like soccer project thing. And some relationships here, and I like the people here, and I like the place a lot. So
great.
this is where we're at.
Could you talk a little bit about your spiritual transformation? Like, how did you grow up? And because I think what you talked about in the beginning about how the lack of spirituality can affect people, especially young people, in terms of
Yeah.
acting, the lack of the sacred. Like, how did you transform as an individual, and what are your thoughts about Islam and Shiaism?
And yeah, and to add to that question, I wanted to mention that I saw that you have linked to a very famous work by Iranian scholar Dr. Ali Shariati about Shia Islam, which was very interesting for me. So maybe you can also tell us about how you got to know the works of Dr. Ali Shariati and how you feel about his works and why it became important to you.
So, okay, there's a few questions there.
It's your childhood and how you got in.
Yeah. So look, I was raised very, very much in the kind of secular liberal world, like no religious presence whatsoever. My mother's family had been like nominally Quaker some generations before, and then with some Episcopal. My father's family was like Episcopalian WASPs, like generations in the colonies since the 1700s, but no one who went to church, no one who cared about these things, to the point where my grandfather was like a staunch like active atheist, and I was always very dissatisfied with that, like from a very young age, just like intuitively dissatisfied with that, to the point where I think, like a lot of people, I think who come from that background, I mean, I even think about like the traditionalists, capital T, um, and like the perennialists, like like Get On and those folks who like started by messing around with the occult, because it's like what's accessible to you. And I was never like that big into all that stuff, but I just mean like when I was a little kid, like it was probably the first thing that was available, and then from there just like trying to search for like what was the sacred, because of that alienation, that like there's so much alienation in Western culture, there's so much lack of community, there's so much of a detachment, um and I don't subscribe to that traditionalism. I think their solutions are a little reactionary to that question of how we've lost the sacred. Right? I agree with them on that premise that we've lost the sacred as a Western society, but I don't think the answer is to like rewind the clock of history. Uh, um, uh, Especially not in some of the ways they've proposed, which can be like sort of nativist and strange. But that's another conversation. I ended up off and on kind of like dabbling in Christianity when I was even like a teenager, because I understood that would have been my religious heritage. Um, and but I didn't know that much about it. And then when I was 18, it was the first time that I really got through with many years of what at times was pretty severe drug abuse. Um, and I was kind of mandated into 12-step programs, which then became a part of my life for a little bit. I have some problems with those, but it is what it is. But the guys that were around were Christians. And what was apparent to me was that, like, Protestantism, and specifically, like, sort of American Calvinist Protestantism, was like, had no appeal to me. I mean, nothing about it spoke to me. And so I'm like 17, 18 at this point. I ended up actually becoming Catholic, and Catholic, and then Orthodox, because my wife, I got married when I was super young. We met when we were 18 and 17, and she was Russian, and we had this kind of like Catholic Orthodox, like, who's correct, and I very chauvinistically assumed that she would just kind of become Catholic. And but I think if one is to accept the premise of the religion called Christianity, which came about, who knows exactly when, maybe around 200-300 AD. If one is to accept the premises that they propose, I think Eastern Orthodoxy is getting to the closest to what that historical practice would have looked like. And so that's what, when people are like, oh, you could look at it like I just sort of like hopped around theologically for years, but actually, to me, it's a very logical path from like no religion to like what's available to the atheist Westerner, like, what's the occult about? Nah, to like, well, okay, I come from Christianity. What's that? Wow, like, Protestantism is totally lacking in any mystical connection and any historical relation to Abrahamic faith, really, to the most ancient forms of Christian worship. And so so I ended up there, and I stayed there for many years. I think my level of devoutness wavered depending on different periods of my life over the ensuing 17 years or so, or no, more like 20 years. But I would have always said, like, no, I'm an Orthodox Christian, for that period of my life. Even if I like wasn't really practicing, like I would have never said, like, I don't believe in God. I would have never said I don't I would have never assumed that I wouldn't like kind of end up back in church at some point, even if I wasn't going. Um, and in the background, though, I had this kind of fascination with Islam that probably started when I read Malcolm X's autobiography when I was a child. From it was like on my dad's shelves, and that was, I think, as my political path, as somebody who really embraced a politics of resistance and justice, that the sort of pacifist quietism of Christianity was always a little unsettling to me, and that that assertion that there was a commitment to justice, to even to social justice, and that there was a right to self-defense within Islam was always something that really appealed to me. And I started being around like the Palestine movement, 20 some years ago. And from Palestinians that I knew, and also from, I grew up in a neighborhood next to a very sort of heavily Arabic neighborhood in Brooklyn. And then some of the Black Muslims that I knew in Atlanta, the kind of unwavering and what seemed to be very pure nature of the faith of a lot of those people had an effect on me. So when I and there were always questions that I had about Christianity. That was one of them, that kind of pacifist, quietist streak, which would sometimes be totally contradicted by the actions of Christians that were sort of justifying it one way, but it wasn't what their dogma said, um, right or wrong. I think the very typical discomfort with the sort of dynamics of the Trinity, and how that could be monotheism, and the identification of Jesus alayhi salam as God. Like in the Gospels, he doesn't say that, and he kind of says the opposite. And it's, like St. Paul says it a bunch later, and like, yeah, Bukhari says a lot of stuff too. um, some of it's great, some of it maybe isn't. But I was uncomfortable with that. And then I think after Donbass, I started to just come back to religion more. I'd never seen a human body blown into pieces until the first day I was in Donetsk. When I went the first day, and there was a market. I was with Ava Bartlett, and we went to this market, and there was.
Oh my God!
Oh, nice.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and it was an elderly woman, and and so to be around like that reality, like so I started going back to churches, but that started that I think like deeper journeying into like back into taking faith more seriously. I had just had another child. I have 4 kids. 3 of them are much older. One of them is 3 years old, and so he was very young, and I think some of these questions that it was easier in my 20s and even teens to maybe just sort of gloss over stuck out to me more. But I would pray and I would go to church sometime. Even back in the States, when I was living in New Hampshire, I would go to this Orthodox church sometime. But I was thinking about, I kept thinking about Islam. And I would read about it, and I would talk to some friends I had about it, who were Muslims, and then the 7th happened, uh, uh, and for a couple months, I was like never in one place for more than a few hours. We were going to, to this march in that city and that march in that city, and then I was on this call or that call, or and I was involved in with some of the Palestine action stuff, and I remember a few really key moments. I remember the first statement of the resistance after the 7th, when all of this crap was coming out about sexual assault and civilians being murdered and all, and when they came out very clearly and said, like, this is what the Quran forbids, and we did not do, and this is why we were doing what we were doing, and the voice was just so clear to me. And then the sort of subsequent, in the subsequent days, like there was just no way to me that the people I saw maintaining that unwavering faith and standing together in that resistance, that these were not the people of God. There was no way. And and even like Khaled Nabhan, who what was it, like 2-3 weeks ago now, the grandfather with Soul of My
grandpa.
Soul.
Yeah.
Yeah. When I saw that the first time, like there was absolutely no question that this was a man who worshipped the one true God. There was no question to me. And so I was even at this point where, like, if I was, I was in some higher leverage situations. Um, I was like saying prayers under my breath to myself in my mind, and I was speaking. I understand, of course, like Allah just means God. It's just God, but I was speaking in those terms already. Um, and and then this thing happened where it felt like something had to change, and we had to go, and I knew that I was sort of ready. I was ready to do that. Uh, and when I got on the airplane, it was a scary moment, right? Like, I had actually, I mean, I've spoken about this before too. Like, there had been like police around some of my properties, like even in those days before. Um, and I was like freaked out, and I wasn't with we weren't married yet, but I wasn't with my child's mother at the time or anyone else. But I opened up the Quran and on the plane and felt like super calmed, like right away. And very quickly, it's like early on that you read about Mary and Jesus, peace be upon him. And so those questions that I had, like, immediately start to make sense. And so I came here and tiptoed for a couple weeks, and like had some more beer a few times,
Before.
and like didn't and like read about this and that, and then didn't know where I could speak English with someone, or uh but eventually it was connected through a sheikh in London who knew someone who spoke good English here, who now I understand what was part of the Tijaniya, a sort of a Sufi order here. And that was where I said my shahada, um and on December 8th. And I really just have devoted a lot of my time since then to study uh and to understanding. uh I mean, I came from this place of like tiptoeing around it for many years and talking to people and reading about history and politics, but not in any internal way. So it was like I had to like learn how to recite the Fatiha, um, till in the beginning, like that. So people started talking about sectarian questions to me. I didn't even know how to go there. Um, Over time, I've begun to understand those things a lot better. Um, uh, I don't. Uh, well, and then my again, then not my wife. She came here in December, and kind of unexpectedly, uh, like, she came home one day on Friday and had said that she'd just gone to the mosque and said shahada. I didn't know
Oh,
she was going
wow.
to do that. And said she had like
Wow.
sort of witnessed a change in me. And then we were married. Uh,
Wow.
uh,
That's very
yeah,
beautiful.
alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah.
And so we so I mean, I've spent a lot of time reading history, um, reading theology, learning some Arabic. I learned some classical Arabic in the beginning, and then a lot of Tunisian. Uh, but when so I mean, Dr. Shariati I had read in the past before, from a political
Mhm.
perspective, just understanding his significance in the revolution, and also just kind of him being this person who had syncretized. I mean, I was always interested in kind of liberation theology movements in general, not just like what we call liberation theology in Latin America, but everything that looked like that. Because I was always very, very against kind of like secularist, anti-religious thoughts in revolutionary circles. Um, and he's just an important an important voice in that discussion. And even just his background as like, having been like a student of, the works of Fanon and so forth, but then being so key to the Iranian Revolution. And I think that I mean, a lot of his writings have spoken to. I mean, gosh, what he I forget the title of it. Is it just called Hajj? His work about the Hajj, where he like breaks down.
Yeah.
I forget the name of it, but he breaks down.
I can't remember actually.
Like metaphorically, like every element of the Hajj and what it means socially, politically. Like it's really brilliant. And the way he like defines ideology in some of his other works. But no, Red Black Shi'ism, I think, again, even for folks who may not be Shia, just the definition of a religious path or in Islam that is focused on the defense of the oppressed and on justice, because it's inherent to what Islam is about, and to what anybody who is a follower of God, I think, needs to be about. There's so much. I mentioned Christian quietism before, and in Islam too. There's sort of ruling class inflicted quietism all over the Islamic world. I mean, especially in the Gulf, especially within Wahhabism.
You have to be careful to say the Gulf. It's the Persian Gulf, because the imperialists have intentionally removed Persian from that Gulf. So it's the Persian.
No, it's true. Yeah.
I'm just telling you what I've been coached into, and I realize that I could verbally
because Iranians feel very like strong about it, because you can see on the maps from like thousands of years ago, even in Arabic, that was called the Persian Gulf in Arabic, Al-Khadija and Farsi, and now everybody's forgetting that, because that's another imperialist project. And now
100%.
it suddenly became the Gulf.
So sorry.
To avoid conflict.
No, it's true. Yeah. No, I mean, all of those terms, the Middle East versus.
West Asia is a great one for people to start using.
Yeah, it is. It's important. And
with Syria, you were talking about how all the client regimes, the Arab client regimes in the Persian Gulf, are just so disappointing. But I mean, Syria was the last Arab republic that had an anti-Zionist, anti-imperialist vibe, and it was, it's now gone. It's a huge loss. It's a tremendous loss we've just suffered in the world. I don't know. How do you feel about that?
Enormous loss. And it's like it gets worse every day. And it was disappointing, the reaction. Well, it was disappointing to see, how deep the propaganda has gotten in a lot of the Muslim world around that. The Muslim world, especially, I expect it from the Americans,
Well, the so-called globalization has Americanized the minds of so many people.
100%. I will point out that again, I'm not saying that Tunisia is some like ideal at this point, and it's a complex place. Any place is complex. But the Tunisian government does not recognize the state of Israel,
Great.
And is very unwavering about that. And that was another sort of must about anywhere I was going to go. I mean, this is a place where like, it outright unequivocal support for the resistance is very standard at every level of society. The PLO was actually stationed here for a while. And the Zionists bombed Tunis in the 80s, and carried out assassinations and things here. So there's, there's a pretty strong tradition of that here. It's not all lost. And of course, the Arabic masses and the masses of basically any Muslim country on earth are with it. The rulers, not necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, there are challenges, like you said, propaganda-wise. I mean, Al Jazeera, like, people are just not aware of like the different Al Jazeeras. I mean, there's the English language one and the Arabic language one, and the English language one is bad enough, in which and when I say bad, I mean, obviously, if you follow Palestine, you think it's wonderful because it reports wonderfully about Palestinian issues, but then they leverage that on people who don't know anything about Syria or don't know anything about, because Qatar has an economic objective to have Syria as their pipeline route. So everything has
Omar Suleiman and such.
Yeah, and the Arabic language version is even worse. It's like on steroids terrible. So Arabic language population who need news really don't have many options. International Arabic language news, there aren't that many good options, and so Al Jazeera has basically brainwashed the masses.
Even
of
with
Arabic
Palestine, even with the Palestinian issues, it's far better than all other mainstream media. But I remember they would call the war in Gaza as Israeli-Hamas conflict for a very long time. Even with Palestine, they know how to frame things and sell it to their audience. But still, because nobody else is doing anything from the mainstream media, from like covering what's happening in Gaza, they're better than the rest of the mainstream media.
I have to go.
Okay,
we're sorry.
But I'm happy to pick this up.
Yeah, so let's just call this part 1, and maybe next time when we come back, we can talk about. I would like to talk more about like your social concerns and social policy, because I really think we can learn a lot from your experience, and I would just love to hear more from you.
I'm happy to pick it up soon. My wife and my son just got back today.
Well, you got a New Year's Eve,
and it's New Year's. Yeah, so I just have to get to that. But I can pick it up. Even in the next few days if you want to continue, because I'm happy.
All right. Well, happy New Year's, and thanks for spending New Year's Eve with us. I really appreciate it.
Yeah,
happy
we
New
really
Year.
appreciate it. How can people follow you, or where can people follow you and your works?
Just my Twitter. It's at JCC Fergie, at JCC FERGIE. Yeah.
I'll make sure.
My other socials are all about like Tunisian football. So Twitter stays in like more grounded in the rest of reality.
All right.
Great. Thank you so much for coming on New Year's Eve. I'm just going to wrap this episode up, and we'll talk to you later. Thanks everyone for watching another episode of Twice Told Tales podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and comment, and subscribe to our channel. See you in the next episode.